Here's a question for you. Do you like World War II video games? You know, Call of Duty, Wolfenstein, World of Tanks, War Thunder. You like those? Awesome. Cool. And here's a second question for you. In those video games, when was the last time that you freed civilian prisoners from a concentration camp? Here's you. Here's the floor. Now that you've had a moment to recover, I'll explain myself. I was watching a friend stream War Thunder when he commented that the model of the HE-51 looked like it was missing something. After a little research, I found out what it was. A swastika. This made me look a little closer at a lot of video games, and you can see over and over where the historically correct models are edited to remove specific symbols. Usually swastikas, but you run into others as well. I guess I should kind of explain where I'm coming from on this. Okay, I'm an American, and Americans tend not to have a really good grasp on global history, especially outside of our borders. There's an old joke that in America 200 years is a long time and in Europe 200 miles is a long way. Kilometers. Whatever. The point is that Americans tend to look at stuff like this and scream, that's censorship, that's just wrong. And in Europe they look at this stuff and say, yeah, but we got laws against this for a reason. Countries like Germany, Poland, and Hungary have laws against displaying, quote, symbols of unconstitutional organizations, like the Nazi Party. Quite literally, if you were to carry a Nazi flag through Berlin, you'd be arrested and face jail time. There are exemptions for artistic, educational, or similar purposes, but the law is actually pretty specific. So, how does this relate to video games? MMOs like World of Tanks and War Thunder are international, meaning that they'd fall under these laws. So, it seems like an open and shut case. The law says you can't do something, you don't do it. However, video games are classified as art in several of these countries, so if a game company wanted to make a case, they'd have a better than average shot. But they don't. I do have ideas as to why, but it starts to drift us dangerously close to tinfoil hat territory. So I'd like to take this moment to remind you to please leave your hands and arms inside the vehicle at all times until it comes to a full and complete stop, at which point you want to walk quickly but carefully to the exits located behind you. Enjoy your ride. First, I want to ask, why do we even like World War II games in the first place? I think this is because for some strange reason, modern society sees World War II as the last good war. We had obvious good guys and bad guys, we had an obvious winner and some high moral ground to stand on, and you add to that the almost 70 years of nostalgia goggles and the American isolation from the aftermath, it's really easy to romanticize World War II. However, nostalgia goggles are at best tinted, but they're usually like horse blinders. When you step back and look at what we choose to remember, it's rather telling. Most AAA World War II games take place in the European theater. Most are from the Allied perspective. A lot of popular ones involve D-Day or invading Germany. Most enemies are generic Nazis as opposed to being Japanese or Germans or Italians. Already you can see a bias forming here. I don't think this is by coincidence, because we want to relive the victory. We want to remember just the good details. And gaming companies are more than happy to sell us the image that we're a really good people because 70 years ago our ancestors kicked ass. America! But this leads to a problem in MMOs. In a single-player game, this really isn't that big a deal. We're quite used to mowing down hundreds of obviously bad guy NPCs, no problem. But in a PvP MMO, someone has to be the opponent. So this means someone has to take the role of bad guy. Now, America's Army deals with this by making your team the US Army and the other team ambiguous bad guys through a software trick. But games that specifically say you play a German tank crew or a Japanese pilot just can't do that. Essentially, these game companies have a major problem, and that is, how do you look somebody in the eye who has a tattoo on their forearm and say, oh yeah, it's a whole lot of fun to defend the fatherland in my panzer? You do it by omission.
Children as young as 13 years old are participating in the virtual army experience, which paints an inaccurate picture of war by glorifying it while sanitizing the real effects.
What he was talking about was the virtual army experience. This is a traveling exhibition the U.S. Army brought to places like amusement parks all around America to, as they put it, highlight the technology of the U.S. military. The main attraction was a simulated mission, and here's where things get into the gray area. As far as I could tell, in this simulated mission, the bad guys are generic, players apparently never died, and they always seem to be successful in their mission. Essentially, you have all the fun parts of combat on display without the weight behind it. Shooting a gun at targets is fun. Watching your buddy's head get blown off or dealing with civilians in the aftermath of combat is not fun. For this argument, that's basically what World War II games are doing. They're conveniently ignoring things like, concentration camps and symbols because those tarnish what's otherwise seen as a good war. It's selecting the parts of history that won't offend people to make your game more popular and ultimately sell better at the cost of true history. To this end, World of Tanks did post something once that's rather revealing. In a post they made in June of 2013, they stated that they strive for historical accuracy. They also state that they take, and I'll quote, a strong anti-fascist position as justification for removing specific Axis emblems and symbols. The problem in my mind is you can't have it both ways. You can't say, oh, we're going to be historically accurate, but we're also going to be censoring history. If you're going to be honest with history, you have to show the bad along with the good. And before people start saying, oh, well, it's just a symbol, it's not that big a deal. It's not just a symbol. I don't really want to get into what branding is, but it's the reason that you see this and think mouse and not 3 circles. Every time you talk about a swastika, some wiki head will point out its history, but reality check, it's going to be associated with Nazi Germany for the foreseeable future. They co-opted the brand, if you will. So when internet folks see this logo, they're not thinking of ancient Sanskrit. They're thinking, oh great, discussion over. The reason is that a swastika is not just a symbol. It carries a lot of baggage with it. Symbols are, well, symbolic. They are given a meaning. So it's not just a logo. Just as this is not just a sports team mascot, this is not just a letter T, and this just wasn't on another art exhibit. 1989, flag on the floor at the Art Institute of Chicago. Made quite a stir. Even if you're just removing this small symbol on the back of an airplane, you're still deleting history. And I can already hear people banging on their keyboards right now, leaving comments and saying, oh, well, I'm not here for a history lesson, I'm just here to play the game. Can't we just play the game? Yet another problem. I am speaking as a product of the American public education system when I say this. At least in my public school, the emphasis was on getting students good SAT and ACT scores and then kicking them out the door in 4 years. I know my school wasn't the only one like this, so where do people get any education these days? Mass media. And they're not always truthful.
A lot of the information that we've been told about the Second World War is wrong.
Did, as some believe, Adolf Hitler base his plans for world domination on secret extraterrestrial knowledge?
Don't laugh. There are people who still believe anything if the man on the screen tells them it's the truth.
Video games are a gateway drug for our kids. And instead of a high, they get a numbness. They get an indifferent heart and a mind that cannot tell the difference between fiction and reality. This is medical fact. This is not crazy theory. I did warn you about tinfoil hat territory, didn't I? There are plenty of people who can't tell fiction from fact, especially when that fiction is backed with multi-million-dollar budgets. This isn't to mention that people outright deny historical events happen. The difference is that now, with a few keystrokes, history can be edited to make their opinion a fact. Wikipedia is knowledge by argumentum ad populum, and that terrifies me. So let's go back to the opening statement and turn it into a question. Should World War II video games be historically accurate? Should they acknowledge things like the Holocaust, or Japanese internment camps, or the ethnic cleansing that took place in Yugoslavia, or the supposed take-no-prisoners mandate that was on both sides of the D-Day invasion? In my opinion, yes. There is a lot of money to be made telling people something they want to hear. 2 words, Fox News. Specific to our discussion, the rose-colored nostalgia goggles that World War II has are pretty powerful. Enough so that people are happy to delete parts of history that might offend or might dirty the purity of the good war and not fight to keep history intact. This touches on the idea of games as art, but in my mind, it's games as a tool to teach. In a society that gets its knowledge from mass media, what's more compelling to a student? Reading about GIs liberating a concentration camp, or them experiencing it first person? Yes, it will be gut-wrenching, but I guarantee they're going to hit up the net to read more about it. But game companies won't do this for fear of offending someone. Honestly, I'm offended at the glaring omissions to history, but whatever. The irony to me is that many games spend a lot of their time and budget trying to make their models historically accurate. The sounds are accurate, the setting is accurate, and yet they wantonly ignore history because it might offend someone. If you're making your rifles and jeeps accurate to the smallest detail, then you should have an obligation to all of history and not just what you cherry pick.
And if that's a problem, then don't base your game in World War II. Base it on something else. I mean, the World of Tanks. It would be a fascinating game if it took place on an actual world of tanks. You know, like Cybertron or something. Problem solved. One more thing before I go, because I don't want people accusing me of hypocrisy. When I play World of Tanks, yes, I do occasionally play a German tank, but you'll notice on the side of the tank, there's an American flag. It wasn't unheard of for American soldiers to capture German tanks and use them on the field of battle as necessary. Which works for me.